Smell of old pine and motor oil hits me every time I think about that garage. My grandfather kept everything in there. Two toolboxes from the 70s, a workbench he built himself from reclaimed barnwood, a 1968 Ford F-100 he'd been restoring since before my mother was born. Every summer I spent at that farm, I'd find him out there at 6 in the morning, coffee in a thermos, radio tuned to country oldies, hands already dirty before breakfast. He called me his shadow. That's what he used to say. Here comes my shadow. Every time I'd show up in the doorway of that garage, squinting against the morning light. I was 7 the first time he handed me a wrench and told me to hold it like I meant business. I was 9 when he let me help him replace the carburetor. I was 12 when he looked over at me during a particularly stubborn bolt and said, "You know, most people quit right about now. I didn't quit. I never quit anything my grandfather taught me to start." His name was Raymond Colt. People in Harlan County, Kentucky knew him as Ray. He'd spent 30 years working for the Tennessee Valley Authority as a civil engineer, before retiring to the family land that had been in our family since 1887. 460 acres of rolling hill country, a farmhouse that was older than anyone living, a timber stand that he managed personally, and that garage with the half-finished truck that he swore he'd complete before he died. He finished it 3 months before his funeral. I was 28 years old when we buried him. I'm a licensed electrician. I work commercial construction, mostly in Lexington, and I've been driving down to the farm every other weekend for the last 2 years to help him with things he couldn't manage alone anymore. Grocery runs, doctor appointments, the property maintenance that gets away from you when you're 81 and your knees don't cooperate. My mother and her brother, my uncle, lived 3 hours away and 6 hours away respectively. They came for holidays, they called on Sundays, they sent cards. I came with my toolbox and stayed through Monday morning. I'm not saying that to make myself sound noble. I'm saying it because it matters to what happened later. Context matters. Showing up matters. And I want to be honest about the fact that I never once thought about the farm in terms of what I'd get from it someday. I thought about it in terms of my grandfather. The way he smelled like sawdust and WD-40. The way he'd stop whatever he was doing if I had a question and give me his full attention like it was the most important thing in the world. The way he left a cup of coffee on the workbench for me on the mornings he heard my truck coming up the gravel drive. He died on a Tuesday in November. Heart failure, which the doctors had been warning about for 8 months. I was with him. I'd driven down that Sunday because something in his voice on the phone the week before had sounded tired in a way I hadn't heard before. Not sick tired, done tired. The kind of tired that lives behind the eyes. We watched football on Monday. He ate most of his dinner. We talked about the F-100 and whether the upholstery shop in Harlan could do a good job on the bench seat. He died in his sleep sometime before dawn on Tuesday. I found him at 6:15 when he didn't come down for coffee. I don't talk about that morning very much. I'm not going to talk about it much now. What I will say is that by Tuesday afternoon, my mother and her brother, I'll call him Uncle Dennis, had both arrived. My mother cried. Uncle Dennis walked through the house with his hands in his pockets, looking at things. I noticed that. The way he walked through each room slowly, methodically, like he was taking inventory. I told myself I was being uncharitable. I told myself why I was being uncharitable. I told myself grief looks different on different people. The funeral was Friday. Half of Harlan County came. Neighbors, former TBA colleagues, men in their 70s and 80s who shook my hand and said things like, "Your grandfather talked about you all the time. Young lady, and Ray was prouder of you than just about anything." I stood at the reception in the church hall afterward and felt like I was receiving condolences for losing 2 people, my grandfather and the version of myself that only existed in his company. The will reading was the following Wednesday. My grandfather's attorney was a man named Mr. Calloway. He'd handled the estate planning, the property documents, everything. His office was in Harlan on the second floor of a brick building on Central Street, and it smelled like old paper and wood polish. Mr. Calloway was maybe 60, calm the way people get when they've seen every version of human behavior that a will reading can produce. My mother sat on my left. Uncle Dennis sat on my right. His wife, my aunt, had driven up and sat beside him. I'd met her maybe 4 times in my life. Mr. Calloway read the will. The farm, the house, the timber rights, the equipment, the mineral rights to any subsurface deposits, everything went to my mother and Uncle Dennis in equal shares. The personal property, including the F-100, went to me. There was a modest cash bequest to a local 4-H chapter that my grandfather had supported for decades. Everything was clear. Everything was straightforward. Mr. Calloway folded the document and asked if there were questions. My mother asked about the timeline for probate. Uncle Dennis asked about the property tax assessment. The meeting was over in 40 minutes. We drove back to the farm in separate cars. My mother made dinner that night and we ate without saying much. Uncle Dennis and his wife took the guest room. I slept in the room I'd always slept in. The one at the end of the hall with the window that looks out over the north field. I thought that was the end of it. I thought I'd go home to Lexington, come back on weekends like always, help my mother figure out what to do with 460 acres she'd never shown much interest in managing. I thought we'd find a way to hold on to it because holding on to it was what my grandfather would have wanted. I was wrong about most of that. It started 3 weeks after the funeral. Uncle Dennis called my mother, not me, and told her he wanted to sell. He'd done some research. The timber rights alone were worth significant money. A developer out of Knoxville had apparently already expressed interest in the land for a residential subdivision project. Uncle Dennis had a number in his head. My mother, who I think was still in the fog of grief and a little overwhelmed by the idea of managing property, said she'd think about it. She called me that night. "Dennis wants to sell the farm," she said. "I know what you're going to say." I said what she knew I was going to say. She said she understood, but Dennis was her brother, and the estate was split equally, and she couldn't just override him. She said maybe we could negotiate, maybe keep the house and sell some of the back acreage, maybe find a compromise. There was no compromise that Uncle Dennis was interested in. Over the next 6 weeks, the conversation shifted. What started as "we're considering selling" became "we're listing in the spring." My mother stopped calling it a possibility and started calling it a plan. She stopped saying "Dennis thinks" and started saying "we've decided." I drove down in January. I sat at the kitchen table where I'd eaten breakfast 1,000 times and told my mother that selling the farm would be the single worst decision she ever made, that it would be a betrayal of everything her father had spent his life building, that 60 years from now, someone's subdivision would be sitting on land that had been in our family since before the Civil War, and nobody would even know what had been there before. She got quiet in the way she gets when she knows something is true, but has already decided to do it anyway. Then she told me that she and Dennis had also decided it would be better if I didn't stay at the farm anymore, while the estate was in probate, while they were working with the realtor. She said it with this careful voice that she uses when she's borrowed someone else's logic, Dennis's logic, and is trying to deliver it like it's her own. I sat there for a moment and looked at the kitchen, the cast iron skillet on the stove, the rolled mason jars on the windowsill that I'd helped my grandfather put up in September, the pencil marks on the doorframe where he tracked my height from age 7 until I was too old and too self-conscious to let him anymore. I asked her if she was serious. She said it was just temporary. She said it wasn't personal. I drove back to Lexington that night. I did not cry until I was on the interstate, which I consider a personal victory. I told myself I was overreacting, that grief was making everyone unreasonable, that this would pass. It did not pass. By February, the locks had been changed. I found out because I drove down one Friday evening without telling anyone, something I'd done 100 times before, and my key didn't work. I sat in my truck in the driveway for about 10 minutes. Then I drove to the Dairy Queen on Route 119 and ate a cheeseburger alone and thought about what my grandfather would say about the situation. He would say, "Don't do anything out of spite that you'll be embarrassed by when you're 70, so I didn't. I called my mother. She said Dennis had suggested changing the security for insurance purposes while the property was in probate. She said she'd send me the new code. She never sent me the new code. I want to be careful here about what I say and how I say it, because I've had a lot of time to sit with this and I've gotten to a place where I can be fair. My mother is not a bad person. She is a person who has always found it easier to go along with what her brother wants than to have a fight she's not sure she can win. That's a choice she's made her whole life, and it's hers to make. I'm not going to pretend it didn't hurt. It hurt enormously, but I understand it better now than I did then. Uncle Dennis, I have less generosity for. I won't perform feelings I don't have. What I did after the lock situation was find myself an attorney, a woman in Lexington who does property and estate work, and who came highly recommended by a colleague. I sat in her office and told her the whole story from the beginning, and she listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Did you ever read the will yourself? The complete document?" I said I'd been present at the reading. I'd heard the whole thing. She looked at me with this measured expression and said, "I'd like to request a copy of the full document from Mr. Calloway's office, if that's all right with you." I said, of course, I didn't understand why it mattered. The will seemed pretty straightforward. It took about 10 days. Then she called me on a Thursday afternoon and asked if I could come in. I sat down across from her desk, and she slid a copy of the document toward me and pointed to a section near the end, a section that had not been read aloud by Mr. Calloway in his office in January. Not because he'd hidden it. It turned out he had assumed, incorrectly, that my mother and Uncle Dennis had read the full document before arriving, as he'd sent it to them in advance. They had not read past the primary bequests. Why would they? They'd gotten what they expected. The section was titled Conditions of Inheritance. My grandfather, who had spent 30 years as a civil engineer and understood that anything worth building requires specifications, had included a set of conditions attached to the property bequest. They were written in plain language, almost deliberately so, as if he'd wanted them to be clearly understood by anyone who read them without a law degree. The first condition, the property was not to be sold, subdivided, or transferred outside the family for a period of 10 years from the date of his death, without the written consent of all direct descendants named in the will. I was named. My consent was required for any sale. The second condition, I was to retain access to and use of the property, including the right to reside there seasonally or as needed for as long as the property remained in the estate. Any attempt to restrict my access constituted a breach. The third condition, in the event of a breach of either of the above conditions, the property interest of the breaching party was to be forfeited and transferred in its entirety to me. I read it twice. Then I looked up at my attorney. She said, "Your grandfather wrote this himself and had it incorporated into the final document about 8 months ago, around the time his health started declining more seriously." 8 months ago. Around the time I started driving down every other weekend, around the time he stopped being able to manage things alone. I thought about the way he'd handed me that wrench when I was 7 and told me to hold it like I meant business. I thought about every Sunday morning in that garage. I thought about the coffee cup he left on the workbench when he heard my truck on the gravel. He knew. He'd known for a while. And he'd done what engineers do. He built a fail-safe. My attorney explained the next steps clearly. We could document the breach. The lock change was straightforward. There were text messages. There was the conversation with my mother about not coming back. There was the listed real estate intention, and file a formal notice. At that point, my mother and Uncle Dennis would have an opportunity to cure the breach by restoring my access and withdrawing from the sale process, or the forfeiture clause would be triggered. I asked her to give me a week before we filed anything. I called my mother that evening. I want to be honest about why I called instead of just letting the attorneys handle it. It wasn't strategy. It was because she was my mother, and despite everything, I did not want her to find out through legal correspondence that her father had anticipated this situation and had protected me from it without telling anyone. She answered on the third ring. I told her about the conditions clause. I read it to her slowly over the phone. There was a long silence. She said, "I didn't know." I told her I believed her. She was quiet for another moment, and then she said, "Dennis isn't going to take this well." I told her that was between the two of them. I told her I wasn't going to pursue the forfeiture. That wasn't what I wanted. What I wanted was my key back, my access restored, and the sale stopped. If they could do those three things, we could move forward without lawyers. Another silence. She said she needed to talk to Dennis. I said, "Mom, I need you to really hear me. This is not something I'm negotiating on. Grandpa built that farm from nothing. He managed it for 60 years. He made his wishes completely clear. I'm not asking you to choose me over Dennis. I'm asking you to honor what Dad asked for." She started to cry. Not the performance kind. The kind that means something broke loose. She said she was sorry, not for Dennis, for herself, for the lock, for the way she delivered the message in January like it was just a logistical thing and not what it actually was. I told her I forgave her. I meant it. 2 days later, I got a call from Mr. Calloway's office. He was apologetic about the oversight in not reading the full conditions clause at the original meeting. He said he should have ensured everyone had reviewed the complete document before proceeding and took responsibility for the miscommunication. I told him I appreciated the call. The code to the new lock arrived by text message from my mother that same afternoon. Uncle Dennis withdrew from the sale agreement. I don't know exactly what was said between him and my mother, and honestly, I don't want to know. He has not called me. I don't expect him to. That's all right. The farm is not for sale. I drove down the first weekend of March, the first time I'd been back since January. I pulled up the gravel drive at 6 in the morning, the way I always do, and sat in my truck for a minute looking at the farmhouse against the gray morning sky. The north field was still winter brown. The garage door was closed. I got out and went to the garage. The F-100 was in there, clean and finished, bench seat and all. My grandfather had left a set of keys hanging on the pegboard hook where he always left keys. I sat in the driver's seat for a while. It still smelled like him in there. Old pine and motor oil and something I can't name but would recognize anywhere. I didn't drive it that morning. I just sat there. People ask me sometimes if I was angry, if I wanted to make my uncle and mother feel what they'd made me feel. The honest answer is yes, for a while. Yes, I wanted them to understand what it felt like to be handed a duffel bag's worth of belonging and told to leave the only place that had ever felt completely like home. But that's not what my grandfather's conditions clause was about, and I think I understood that pretty quickly once I got past the initial shock of it. He didn't build that failsafe to give me leverage. He built it to give me protection. There's a difference. Leverage is about power. Protection is about love. The greatest thing he ever gave me wasn't the farm and it wasn't the truck. It was the standard he held himself to every day, in that garage, in that farmhouse, in every conversation we ever had. He was the same person in private as he was in public. He never said one thing and did another. He never confused what he wanted with what was right. I'm trying to be that person. Some days I'm better at it than others, but I have the farm, I have the truck, I have the key on the pegboard and the coffee cup on the workbench, and the marks on the doorframe showing how tall I was at 7, at 9, at 12. And I have that wrench he handed me 20 years ago still in my toolbox, which I will hold until the day I die, like I mean business. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since all of this happened, not in any mystical sense, just in the plain, honest way that my grandfather Raymond lived his whole life. The idea that what you build and how you build it and why you build it determines what survives you. My uncle wanted to sell that farm because he saw 460 acres and ran the numbers. That's not an evil thing, exactly. It's a limited thing. He looked at the land and saw a transaction. My grandfather looked at the same land for 60 years and saw a responsibility. Those two ways of seeing don't coexist easily, and I think Grandpa Raymond understood that long before the rest of us did. That's why he built the failsafe. Not out of bitterness, out of clarity. That's the part I keep coming back to. He didn't leave that conditions clause because he was angry at his son. He left it because he was honest with himself about what he knew, about what was likely to happen when he was no longer there to hold things together. Most people, when they're facing the end of their life, want to believe the best about their family. Grandpa Raymond loved his family and still looked at the situation with clear eyes. That takes a specific kind of courage that I'm not sure I fully appreciated until I needed it. What I've learned about integrity, real integrity, not the bumper sticker version, is that it has to work when nobody's watching, when there's no immediate reward, when the easier thing is also the more comfortable thing. My uncle chose comfort. My mother, at least eventually, chose something harder. I watched her choose it in real time over the phone, and I have a lot of respect for that, even now. The thing about resilience that nobody tells you is that it doesn't feel like strength when you're in it. Sitting in my truck in the dark outside a farmhouse where my key no longer worked, I did not feel strong. I felt like someone had taken something from me that had no replacement. The farm wasn't just property, it was the context in which I understood who I was. Take that away and you're not just homeless, you're unmoored. What got me through was something Grandpa Raymond said to me once when I was about 14 and something at school had gone badly and I was sure it was the end of the world. He handed me a wrench and said, "Do the next right thing. Don't think past that. It's such a simple thing. It's almost embarrassingly simple." But I drove to Lexington. I found an attorney. I made the phone call to my mother instead of letting lawyers handle it coldly. One right thing at a time. I'm not a perfect person, and I didn't handle every moment of this gracefully, but I didn't do anything out of spite that I'd be embarrassed by at 70. Grandpa Raymond told me not to, and I have never once found a reason to doubt his judgment. The farm is still there. The F-100 is still in the garage. The wrench is still in my toolbox. That's enough.